Perhaps the greatest fear about artificial intelligence is it will eventually replace human intelligence altogether. Because if AI takes over decision-making, what's irreplaceable about humans? AI scholar and researcher Neil Lawrence takes this topic head-on in his new book, The Atomic Human: What Makes Us Unique in the Age of AI, and he joins us to talk about it. I'm Jennifer Strong, and this is Shift.
Now here on the steering column is a device called Auto Cruise. You simply set the speed you want.
Self-driving robo-taxis are already on the road in 2 U.S. cities.
As the disc rotates, a mirror reflects the light in the way that depends on how the signal was recorded.
This is the 100 terabyte I present to you Electro, the Moto Man.
Ladies and gentlemen,
I would say that one of my greatest skills is my ability to interact with humans.
This episode, we look at human intelligence through the lens of the artificial.
I'm Neil Lawrence. I'm a professor of machine learning at the University of Cambridge.
You also have a new book, The Atomic Human: What Makes Us Unique in the Age of AI. So what makes us unique in the age of AI?
Good question, isn't it? And that's exploring that was why I sort of wrote the book. Although the reveals in the first chapter, and for me, what makes us unique is our limitations and our vulnerabilities, and the fact that they're an intrinsic part of our intelligence. And the motivation for writing the book was because I think the conversation around AI at the moment is horrific. It fails to acknowledge that point. And it just felt really important to try and get that across.
Can you unpack that a little bit more? What do you mean?
So what's really interesting about us compared to the machine, and the sort of analogy I use in the book is to look at what it means for someone to be locked in. So someone to lose the ability to speak and communicate. And I talk about Jean-Dominique Bauby, who had a brainstem stroke, so could only communicate by winking. And the point I make is that compared to the computer, we're all in the same state as Bauby. Because while Bauby can only communicate by winking, and we communicate by speaking, the machine communicates through electromagnetic radiation, which is 1 million times faster in its propagation than the speed of sound. So while we are 300 times faster than Bauby in our communication rate, 300 is quite a lot. So he was winking words to dictate his book, and I can speak those words. So I go 300 times faster than him. The machine is 300 million times faster than us. And this is at the heart of the digital era. And I find it incredibly frustrating that that's not the point that's being acknowledged. People are talking about, oh, we'll have intelligences that are order of magnitude greater than ours. It's a nonsensical statement. Our intelligence isn't a rankable thing. You can't sort of line up intelligence like you can height and say which is better. And indeed, that category error is at the heart of eugenics. So the eugenicists thought, oh, well, intelligence is like height. We just need to measure it and breed more intelligent people. Bad things follow. Intelligence isn't like that. But information is. Information transfer rates are. We can rank them. And you can already see, without AI, that the machine is 300 million times faster than us. And Bauby is only 300 times slower than us. And that's at the heart of the nature of our intelligence. So it's not just that limitation. It's how we overcome that as a society through our culture, through our practices. So that's the limitation. The other piece is the vulnerability. Yeah, go ahead, Jennifer. Yeah, I've rambled too long already. No, you go ahead.
Please ramble away. I don't have to tell you this is different from most conversations I have with people working in the field. Keep going.
And that's kind of why it's such a horrific moment, because the conversations you're having are not with the most sophisticated people, I would claim. Because what's happening is those with the simplest, most unnuanced perspectives on intelligence, with cheekily I say, with the least social intelligence, with the least social awareness, are those that are dominating the debate. Ironically, because, of course, those simplistic messages are easy to communicate and are something that our low bandwidth minds, we focus on. So people who don't have a deep understanding of the area are more likely to pick up these very simplistic messages. And then unfortunately what happens is the people who propagate the simplistic messages find that that's getting them more attention, and then they sort of become a simplistic message themselves, even sophisticated people. So that's the really deeply unfortunate thing that's happening around the debate. And I think that process is incredibly dangerous because, there's been over the last year and a half sort of talk about existential threat from AI, technological existential threat. Well, I don't want to dismiss that argument entirely, but compared to the socio-technical existential threat, it's an irrelevance. And the people who are pushing the technical existential threat are bringing about the socio-technical existential threat by undermining society, by undermining social mechanisms we have in place through a very simplistic view of the way things work. And unfortunately, that view is also getting mind share with governments and people in decision making. That's why I considered the conversation to be atrocious. In fact, it was a lot better conversation 2 years ago. The conversation has degraded rapidly with the advent of large language models in the public consciousness.
I would say there's also this air of inevitability around the entire conversation. I spent the better part of the last year working on a documentary for NPR stations here in the US called The Race to Superintelligence. It's really just meant to make everyone feel like they have permission to understand what's going on, what the real capabilities are and aren't, and just to take a little mental pause, I would say.
Yeah.
And so I found your book is brilliant. What do you hope to achieve with it?
It's hard because I think you're looking to get a message out there, and I started it 10 years ago, and had been writing it on and off. So it's been a long-term project, and it's been interesting watching the public conversation ebb and flow, and sort of trying to sort of stand back a bit. The first wave of this conversation, the misguided conversation, kind of stopped when we had Cambridge Analytica and various data scandals around AI, and actually, at the time, that's what I was writing about. So some of the analogies in the book date back to then. Things I talk about, like the digital oligarchy and System Zero, are things I was writing about at the time. So you sort of got half an eye on the current public conversation, but an awareness that it's, that chasing it too much is like chasing a leaf in the wind. You're trying to work out what the fundamentals are. But I do think we are at a moment of steerage. This is a very transformational technology, large language models. I mean, despite the fact that the notion of superintelligence and artificial general intelligence to me are absurd, this is a transformational technology. And I try and communicate that in the book. At the moment, the debate seems to be split between those who are sort of saying that superintelligence is just around the corner and it's either a utopia or a dystopia, and those who are saying, no, this is nowhere near superintelligent. I almost think none of those things, like curse on all your houses, you're all sort of oversimplifying the situation. I mean, it's a transformational technology. It doesn't replace humans. The notions of superintelligence and artificial general intelligence are all absurd. But what it does is it gives us access, regular people, it allows them to talk to a computer, and they're talking to something that has access to 300 million times greater information bandwidth than them. And that's transformational. It's really transformational. So back to your question, apologies, rambling again. What am I hoping to achieve? Well, to get some of these more nuanced ideas out there, because I'm not a minority in thinking what I think, in speaking as I speak. I think that the real challenge with these ideas, and potentially the challenge with the book, and one of my great concerns is I haven't achieved it, is to cut through with these ideas, because they're a bit more nuanced. They don't sit within a simple headline that's very clickable. They don't make very good clickbait. And that's why we're not hearing from them. It's not that I'm in a minority. I believe I'm in the majority of experts, people who are sort of, say, in academia, who've been in this technology for decades. But the cut through is very hard because the message is slightly more nuanced than the messages that tend to cut through.
This is frequently a problem for academia.
It's a problem for academia, and in some sense, this is my best shot at it. And So it takes 10 years. And I think there's I mean, when you've read it, so you'll have a better idea to what extent I succeeded than failed. But it's also trying to do that. I think one of the problems is you sort of try to cut through without reducing the whole thing to a cartoon. And that's such an interesting and difficult, and it was a great pleasure to write, a great pleasure to read. I mean, it was a great experience to create it, because I just think trying to tread that line has been extremely interesting.
Yes, it's a chance to speak to someone outside of your circle too, right? I think that's the hardest part of what I'm doing in my work, is just trying to make sure that everyone feels invited to a conversation that really we should all take some ownership for. It's not up to a handful of people, especially as you've described them, to make decisions for the entire world.
And that's one of the ways in which the conversation has degraded most, because the message we've been getting, I think, over the last, I mean, it's faded a bit now. I've been glad to see, because it was so bad. I don't think it could have sustained, but I think we need to do exactly what you said. The message we've been getting from people is that this is a technology that only a few people or no one understands, and only a few people are capable of creating and or managing. And what that leads to is a sort of highly monopolistic situation where very few companies are controlling one of the most important information technologies in human history. And the analogies I talk about in the book, I think, I love going to the past to find equivalent things, and they are there. But of course, you have to be aware of the differences. It's the scale of this, and the speed at which this can be deployed. But in many respects, in terms of social transformation, it's no different from previous waves of information technology change, but they are associated with mass social disruption, whether it's the printing press and the sort of Reformation, or whether it's radio and propaganda in the Second World War, alongside espionage in the Second World War, alongside rapid organization, combined arms movements of total changes in the way we do battle, or even up to the Rwandan genocide. Radio is right there. So these information technologies, as information, the way information moves changes, it has a significant effect on society, because there's this constant sort of balance between people who are controlling access to the information and controlling the message, and society's ability to sort of give wide access to that, but also, limit those who would use those channels for nefarious purposes.
You've used a variant of The Sorcerer's Apprentice at times to describe the moment we're living in. Do you mind to share that story?
I mean, it's the best summary I could make of what I think is going on. So The Sorcerer's Apprentice, I think, made perhaps most famous by Disney's Fantasia, but really going back to the sort of 19th century. It's a Goethe poem in German. I think there's Alberlinger or something like that. And then it has music put to it by Paul Dukas, which is what Disney used in Fantasia. But the story is an interesting story, because it's the one of a sorcerer who understands and creates spells. And in the Disney version, we see the sorcerer doing that at the beginning, sort of leaving, and the apprentice sort of saying, I could maybe run one of these to do my chores. And while the apprentice can cast the spell, what they can't do is control the spell, and sort of chaos of results. Now, in the Disney thing, we sort of see that chaos resolved by the sorcerer returning. But in the original poem, I think go to the words of the sorcerer are Besen, Besen, seid's gewesen, which I'm not an expert in German, but I think that roughly means broom, stop it. And everything goes back to normal. And the apprentice learns their lesson not to meddle with their master's spells. We're in that situation where we have sort of big tech companies in the role of the apprentice, and their CEOs, because their CEOs, although everyone thinks they're deeply technical expert, they didn't develop any of this stuff. They're just learning it and casting it. And that's one of the problems. They're viewed as somehow technically expert. They are not technically expert in society. They're not technically expert in the algorithms themselves, yet governments are constantly turning to them for answers, and even many of their employees. And who is technically expert in it? Well, actually no one, because the effect of these sort of algorithms on society is socio-technical. So no one but everyone, and that's where the sort of the epilogue, which I think if people are interested in the book, you can read the epilogue before and after the book. The epilogue could be a prologue as well. Then sort of highlights that, well, the way society deals with these type of disruptions is through what Karl Popper called the open society. And there's this wonderful duality that I think Fantasia is something like 1941, and Popper's book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, is, I think, 1944. So these things come out in the 40s under the shadow of fascism. And what Popper is saying is, look, the way we do things in society is not through people having amazing ideas that fix the whole of society. In fact, even great people who have great ideas, they make great mistakes. And what actually happens is it's about the little people. And the little people spread across open society, whether that's the educators or, the health professionals, the nurses, about all of these people, I should say, even lawyers and civil administrators, working towards the principles that their professions are supposed to uphold. Not working towards, I've cornered the market, therefore I can price gouge everyone, which is what a lot of professions seem to be doing, but working towards, no, what my profession is supposed to do is protect people for their health vulnerabilities or their legal vulnerabilities, or in the accountant's case, financial vulnerabilities, or in the teacher's case, support them in their education. And those are the people, what Popper calls piecemeal social engineers, who are on the ground facing the actual situation. And they sort of need to be empowered to deliver solutions. So that's kind of how society works. And it moves forward in this, there is no solution. The point is, there is no optimal way of working. All there is muddling along in the best way we can and constantly trying to improve that. And the people who often know best how to improve that are the people who are facing the problems, but only if they're empowered. And unfortunately, this technology, in a difference to the Sorcerer's Apprentice, it also disempowers the sorcerer in its casting, because the open society, historically, the way it wielded information, the way these things were done, was mostly through paper. Mostly through, accountant is doing double entry bookkeeping, or a lawyer is, writing a brief. And anyone who's sharing and moving information almost kind of has direct control of how that information is being recorded and moved. Or if they want access to how it's being recorded, they can get the files. And of course, in the information technology era, it looks very different, because the reason why information comes from those who can write is it originates with scribes. It originates with scribes and the invention of writing, sort of going back 3,500 BC, so over 5,000 years ago. And the scribes had an enormous power, because the scribes recorded legal judgments and recorded the movement of goods and contracts. So the modern scribes turn into professions. So you don't just have the power, you have responsibility. As I say, we would like them to take the responsibility more and perhaps the power less in the modern era. But it's true that, lawyers have responsibilities, as do health professionals and educators and everyone else. But what's happening is they're maintaining that responsibility, but they're losing the power to operate the information infrastructure, because the information infrastructure, the modern scribes, are software engineers and big tech companies who are gaining the power, but have none of the responsibility that's incumbent with that power, and are actively looking to not accept that responsibility, claiming that they only provide solutions. And so this is where the sort of socio-technical existential threat comes from, because it's a simultaneous disruption of society that is actually undermining society's mechanisms through which it heals itself. And, it's not going to all collapse next week in the manner of these technical existential threats that they describe. But over time, it has a very significant disruptive effect, particularly on the open society, or what we would describe as modern democracies, is what Popper is referring to as the open society.
Well, I was going to ask you what part of the book you were most proud of. It sounds like we should all head for the epilogue.
Yeah, just read that and put it down. You don't even have to buy it.
Did anything surprise you while working on this?
Yeah. I tell you what the biggest surprise was. You're sort of thinking, well, if this idea I'm thinking of is true, there must be something that illustrates it. So the whole book, to some people's chagrin, is not written as like I'm doing now, telling people how it is. It's written through narratives and stories that illustrate and allowing people to bring their own experiences to it, which was very important to me. I'm perhaps less like that when I speak, but when I had time to sit and write, I felt that's the right way of doing it. Otherwise, I'm just doing what the people you mentioned were doing, which is telling everyone how it is. And I don't want to do that. So the book is not really very soundbitey. It uses a lot of analogies to try and communicate what I'm thinking about this stuff to other people. There was something early on that I noticed about the way which, say, the sort of Silicon Valley techno-solutionists talk about the technology, which is highly reminiscent of early religion. And this is quite a long time ago, I was having these thoughts, and the way they talk about what it's going to do is very similar. I mean, maybe not early religion, but sort of religion around the sort of dawn of civilization. So Greek myth and these sort of things. And the sort of existential threats are very like, I'm going to upload my brain and become immortal. And so you say, oh, wow, there's this mental immaturity in thinking about what great power would bring. So presumably, these civilizations, their earlier religions were animistic, but then, what you can see embedded in certainly Greek myth is all the trades, weaving and all the things they're doing now. They live in cities. And then you can sort of see the thinking around what the gods do. Well, they're sort of just powerful versions of humans with all those flaws, which is kind of what makes them entertaining. I think listening to Stephen Fry's sort of audiobook versions of these, I think he has various analogies that it's sort of like they're like Woodhouse characters, Hera's Aunt Agatha and this sort of thing, which I found very compelling. And that is a lot of fun, but I think it isn't a very representative perspective of if there were an external intelligence. I'm not personally religious, an external intelligence that is all sort of powerful in that way, what it would be like, because it would be totally different from us, because it isn't us. It doesn't have the same limitations and vulnerabilities. And I think you sort of see that with where I most respect modern religion is where it's introspective, and you use this outside intelligence, the notion of this outside intelligence, to introspect. And I think that's an incredibly powerful thing. So I had that sort of as a background. And then there was a separate thought, I've already sort of said 300 million times faster. I try and use various analogies to get across because it's a big number and it's difficult, something that's not in the book that I started sort of thinking about, is, the difference between 300 million and our walking space is you're going from walking pace to the speed of light, basically, something like that. These are sort of extraordinary things because we walk at about a meter per second, These are just extraordinary things that you sort of think about, roughly speaking. But one of them was, and it comes from a sort of passion I have for thinking about deep time and geology that comes from my early career, starting to realize that, okay, what would information transfer rates look like if they were 300 million times slower? And then thinking, I wonder what happens if you look at ecology in the propagation of genetic information through time. And yet, sure enough, it's about 4 billion times slower amongst humans than I'm speaking now. So, roughly speaking, all the information transferring to the next generation through our genome, the maximum rate of transfer at the moment is, roughly speaking, the same amount of information that a fast-talking New Yorker's sharing as they sort of share their news. So what that means is that the machine looking at us, of course, the machine isn't conscious in the way so that's a sloppy use of language, but the machine perceiving us and our rate of movement is equivalent to us perceiving evolution. So you just sit there and watch your garden evolve and watch new species come about. And when you think about the implications of that, this is where things, I think, get very important for the lessons, is that the reason we struggle to understand the effect of the machine is because it's going so much faster than us. And the reason we struggle to understand our effect on our climate and our ecology is because it's going so much slower than us. And so you end up with this thing where you realize, okay, the ecology is slower, but it's actually much more complex than we are. Even though our culture, we're complex as an individual species, but we're part of the ecology. We're produced by it. We're within it. And the ecology around us is incredibly complicated as we learn when we disrupt it. And simultaneously, even though the machine's many times faster than us, it's a lot less complex than our culture and what we are. So you have this sort of challenge where the ecology is the complex, slow-moving thing. We are the sort of in the middle lane, medium complexity, and the machine is in the fast lane, extremely fast, but not complex at all. And just as we undermine our ecology by failing to understand its complexity and the time frames over which it's operating, so we start burning coal sort of 200 years ago, from the ecology's perspective, that's like hitting it with a hammer. The machine starts making decisions about what information to share amongst us with all the access to information it has. From our cultural perspective, that's like hitting it with a hammer. And that's the disruption we're seeing. I suppose that wasn't the most surprising bit, because the most surprising bit was, and I have to frame this correctly, is like, oh, I've got to the point where, according to my arguments, which is trying to push the use, and I don't write this in the book, but it's something that I'm sort of dwelling on. So trying to sort of be careful about the use of the word intelligence and focus more on information processing and look at different information processing ecosystems, because intelligence is so personal. But if we extrapolate that to say, well, the machine is an information processing ecosystem that's making decisions. We're an information processing ecosystem that's making decisions. Very different characters, and that's one of the things the book talks about. The ecology is an information processing ecosystem that's making many, many decisions according to environmental factors. And then it was like, oh my goodness, and it's beyond my imagining, and it's not an intelligence in the way we think of it, but it sits outside us. And so even though I'm like quite an atheist, I came to this sort of perspective on us as the product of this information, which I don't know, is an interesting thing to think about. You know, it's obviously not a sentient God or anything like that. It doesn't have forward thinking, but we are created by it, and we sit within it, and it is beyond our imagining, and it is way more complicated than anything a single human can imagine. So one of the things the book looks at in the last chapter is, what do those things mean for how we have to respond to? And of course, I can't deal with the climate crisis and AI, and I'm not saying that the book deals with either fully, but it hints at one of the problems we face, which is the way we want to react with information processing ecosystems is to anthropomorphize them. And if they're not working on the same timescales we're working on as us, whether they're going 300 million times faster or 4 billion times slower, we struggle to make reasoned decisions about them. And when you look at old cultures, how did they deal with that? Well, they had practices like animism, which, aren't true in the logical sense of being true, but as a cultural truth, extremely helpful for people in coexisting within their ecology. And I think one of the things that strikes me is that, if we are to continue as a species over, and I'm not just talking like 100 years, but thousands of years, we have to recover those approaches somehow. And we have to also see AI in the same way. It can't be seen as this version of a human that's very, very powerful. It has to be seen as an information processing system that's much faster and has strengths and weaknesses, like fire, brings good, but also danger at the same time.
The book is brilliant, as I've said, and congratulations on getting it out there as well after a long journey.
Oh, thank you very much, Jennifer.
This episode was produced by me and Emma Silikans and mixed by Garrett Lang, with original music from him and Jacob Gorski. Thanks for listening. I'm Jennifer Strong.